The New South Wales and Victorian governments have released their back-to-school plan 1 week from the start of Term 1. To talk through the latest developments, I'm joined by Dan Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs and Richie Merzian from the Australia Institute. Good to see you both, and thanks so much for your time today. First to you, Dan. We had the latest announcements with the schools with Victoria and New South Wales. It seems like remote learning is a thing of the past in this pandemic. They're not going to be closing schools anymore. They're throwing out contact tracing and they're going to try and keep schools open. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, millions of parents will be breathing a sigh of relief at what has been said today out of Victoria and New South Wales. Hundreds and thousands of school kids have been subject to such a difficult period. They've lost 2 years from their lives, 2 years of education, 2 years worth of socialisation with their friends. And that's ultimately not something that can ever be recovered. And we know that school closures have had a very significant negative impact on mental health, on families, on the ability, for example, if you're a single mum with 3 kids stuck in a 2-bedroom apartment, it's incredibly difficult to hold down a job and educate your kids from home. So this is a big step in the right direction. It also underscores the importance of never going back to lockdowns ever again and never going back to school closures. Everything needs to be directed towards keeping kids in school, because in so many ways that is the linchpin of how families work and it's the linchpin of our society. There are a couple of caveats to that. We know that they're going to maintain some form of rapid antigen testing and mask wearing, at least for the first 4 weeks of school. Now, I understand the motivation, the reasons for that. However, if we are to truly move to living with COVID, and if we are truly to get to normalcy once again, ultimately we will need to treat COVID-19 like any other cold or flu situation, where it's primarily the responsibility of parents to call up the school and say, if your kid is sick, get them to stay home. But overall, this is definitely a step in the right direction and fantastic news for kids and so many parents across the country.
Richie, what is your thoughts with making kids take twice weekly negative rapid antigen tests in order to keep going to school? And some parents, keep in mind, have multiple children. They could be doing 6 to 8 tests, every single week. And that's going to be hard to keep going week after week.
Yeah, look, as a parent of school-aged kids, I'm looking forward to sending the kids back, and certainly the kids are too. Look, if it requires doing regular rapid antigen tests, then that's the price to pay. The problem, though, is that this is not like the flu or the cold, and most kids under 12 still haven't been vaccinated. And so there's still a lot of questions around how this will all operate. If a kid does get COVID and you call into the school, what will happen then? If there's multiple kids, will they close the classroom? Will they close the year down? As we've seen in the past as well. And also behind all this, there's a patchwork system of income supports and the realities of insecure work that could undermine this whole process. I mean, the federal government made arbitrary and decisive cuts to paid pandemic leave, excluding hundreds of thousands of parents from that level of support, many casuals. And so the federal government should, at least alongside this, expand payment for all workers at that same rate. This would be the best way to actually ensure that this start back to school ensures that parents can manage as well.
Dan, do you agree with those comments there?
I have a slightly different perspective. I think the issue with rapid antigen test is more so from the perspective of, I agree to the extent that it's going to be difficult for parents to be able to manage this, and that we need to be able to move past the idea that we're focusing and counting only case numbers. The linchpin to getting beyond the current restrictions, whether they're in schools or the rest of society, is to focus on the severity of the COVID variant. And we know that Omicron overall is much less severe than previous variants. Yes, it spreads faster, but there is less to be concerned about from a health perspective. And my concern is that if rapid antigen tests become normalised in our schools, and this might be something that we end up seeing for months on end. So I understand the motivation for having the first four weeks of the school term to see how this goes, but ultimately there needs to be a pathway out of having masks of kids, and also a pathway out of having rapid antigen testing.
Richie, one interesting thing is through the Delta lockdowns, we saw Gladys Berejiklian and Daniel Andrews in COVID presses throw barbs at each other, but now we've got this united front with Dominic Perrottet and Daniel Andrews.
That's right. The New South Wales Premier went out of his way to thank the Victorian Premier for working so closely and cooperatively. It's good to see. I mean, we've got the two biggest states representing the majority, or at least the lion's share of students, at least working on the same page. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to extend to the rest of the country with a real mixed approach. And you feel like with the states pushing and making sure that there's millions of rapid antigen tests, masks, air purifiers, shade cloths, all going out to the schools, that they're still making up for the gaps the federal government has left in not really pulling all these necessary resources together. Good to see these states back and working cooperatively. It'd be great to see the entire country doing the same.
All right, let's move on, Dan, to Western Australia. Of course, we had the announcement about him extending the hard border from February 5 in Western Australia. Mark McGowan, the New South Wales Deputy Leader of the Liberals, Stuart Ayres, said he's doing that because he's worried about his own health system coping in WA. And many people are saying, well, he's had a long time to fix that health system. What are your thoughts about the border?
Well, it can only be described as a broken promise and a very significant failure of political leadership and also failure of public policy. We know that ultimately the hard border in Western Australia will end. It's just a question of if it will die a slow death or a fast death. We now know it's going to die a slow death, and it will be a protracted way out of having the hard border. The experience of the other states in Australia is once Omicron gets into the community, it's basically impossible to get those numbers down to zero. And the issue here from a public policy perspective for McGowan is that he's really fighting yesterday's war. He still seems to be pursuing essentially an elimination strategy, if not a suppression strategy, that has proven to be unviable, or it can only come at such a significant economic and humanitarian cost in the other states and also across the world. Now, it's perhaps understandable that so many Western Australians supported McGowan when they were basically able to have zero COVID and avoid domestic lockdowns in Western Australia. Now, that, of course, came at significant cost for the rest of the country, but I think most Western Australians were comfortable with that. The big policy question from here on out is obviously, one, when and how will the border open? But secondly, how will McGowan respond to an increase in cases? What is he going to do to Western Australians? Is he going to lock them down? Is he going to extend mask mandates? Is he going to even have more draconian vaccine mandates? This is the next public policy question that needs to be asked. And I think it would be helpful for the public if the opposition in Western Australia and also federally, the coalition, were to begin raising some of these questions of how will McGowan respond when there is an increase to cases.
Richie, there are a lot of people in Western Australia, and everyone in Western Australia really hasn't had to deal with COVID for the past 2 years to the same extent that those in the eastern states have. There's many in Western Australia that support Mark McGowan and want him to keep those borders closed. They just don't have a lot of sympathy for those who have family on either side of the border. What's your take?
It's a harsh situation, and knowing people personally who have suffered, who are getting locked out and haven't seen family in 2 years, your heart goes out to them. You can't help but feel that there's a certain level of ill preparation behind all this, and Kenny, you noted that in terms of the lack of preparation in WA for COVID, which might eventuate in the same numbers. The big question to ask is, why would the WA health system not be up to scratch right now? We had a gas-fired recovery pushed on us as the response to COVID, but we've had a gas boom in the past. WA has been a major beneficiary. That money should have been invested in the community, but we know that only 1% of government revenue right now comes from these gas plants that have boomed in the past. To some extent, WA hasn't been investing in preparing for this situation, and that's a low tax base that's not taking advantage of the gas boom and the fossil fuels coming out of the West and investing it back in the system. Maybe if we had a better taxation system for gas, if gas-fired recovery led to that investment back in the system, then we might be in a different situation. But for those who are suffering right now, certainly sympathise.
Dan Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs and Richie Merzian from the Australia Institute. Thanks so much for joining me on Weekend Live today. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Pleasure. Thank you.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.